I want you to imagine a little scenario with me. Imagine that in the next few years, a scientist develops a machine that can quantifiably improve people's ability to solve certain kinds of problems, maybe complex problems in engineering or molecular biology, in areas where other researchers have kind of hit a wall in their ability to figure things out. But when you hook yourself up to this imaginary machine of ours, your brain activity changes in such a way that the solutions to these tough problems are suddenly obvious to you. Everyone who hooks themselves up to this machine can suddenly understand exactly how to solve some of the toughest puzzles in whatever field they're an expert in. They instantly become a groundbreaking genius in their thinking. Now imagine you take one of the scientists who designs genius machines, and you hook him or her up to a genius machine and have him or her design an even better version of the genius machine. And then you hook someone up to the better version and you have them design an even better version. And you bootstrap this loop in which the technology keeps getting better and better and people keep getting smarter and smarter, and it spirals from there. Now that's equal parts exciting and scary, isn't it? I mean, maybe you lean a little more toward the exciting side of that, or maybe you're strictly on the side of, no, that would just be straight up really scary. But one way or another, we can all agree that our current culture and our society as it is today are probably not well equipped to deal with that big of a paradigm shift, right? Where suddenly anyone can become a genius or a super genius at the flick of a switch. I mean, even if we had the knowledge to make that happen, we probably don't have the wisdom to know how to deal with a world that would look that different from our own. Well, guess what? This is actually not completely science fiction. My guest on the podcast today works with teams of researchers who use a technology called transcranial direct current stimulation, TCDS, to measurably increase the rates at which people are able to solve certain types of tricky problems. And he also works with teams who study the neuroscience of mindfulness meditation, and the neuroscience of consciousness, and the neuroscience of altered states of consciousness. And he looks for ways to integrate and synthesize information across all these fields, trying to get all these teams of researchers speaking a sort of common language, helping them share data and collaborate to arrive at new kinds of insights. Because the biggest challenge this guy sees right now is the one I mentioned a few seconds ago. It's exactly the problem of wisdom. We're on the verge of some major revolutions in neurotechnology. And the reason this freaks many of us out is that our culture doesn't seem to have a scientifically driven form of wisdom. You know, something based on data, on our actual understanding of the universe, to help us understand how to function in a world where all the traditional boundaries and categories seem to be breaking down. So it's with great excitement that I welcome John Vervaeke to the Connectome podcast. John, thank you so much for joining us today. I'll start by diving into an aspect of your research that first intrigued me personally, which is your work with these teams of researchers who have quantifiably improved people's intuitive problem-solving abilities. These researchers have been able to significantly increase the percentage of people who solve certain famously tricky problems by electrically stimulating their brains in certain ways. And now this is kind of strange, right? Because we ordinarily think of intuition as something very fuzzy, don't we? I mean, it's something that's very hard to describe and that's even harder to measure. So how do you go about quantifying someone's intuitive problem-solving ability?
Okay, well, I mean, I concentrate on a particular aspect. I concentrate on solving insight problems, right? These are problems in which the original way in which the person has formulated the problem actually prevents them from solving the problem. It blocks them. So the quantification issue is more that's a tricky thing to say because metaphysically, nothing is intrinsically an insight problem, right? And in fact, the universe doesn't contain problems. The universe just is. So what you can quantify is more what you're trying to quantify, what you're trying to get at are what are the cognitive processes and ultimately what are the neurological processes that are at work when people are trying to break out of an inappropriate problem formulation and reformulate the problem. And there seems to be a bunch of attentional processes that we're getting a clearer understanding of. And you can't still directly quantify the processes per se. I mean, you can quantify the results and do the stats on them as you can in all sort of psychic experiments. But we're getting a clearer picture of some of the attentional processes that are at work. And then we're also getting a picture about sort of how brain activity is shifting around when people are solving insight problems. There's a sense in which you will never be able to quantify like insight problems because they don't intrinsically exist. We're getting closer at bringing sort of some rigorous mathematical modeling to both the patterns of activation and the patterns of connectivity in the brain that are occurring in an insight problem. And we're getting much better experimental measures of the attentional processes that are at work.
So it's not about measuring intuition per se, because as you say, intuition itself is kind of a subjective category. It's more about measuring the neurological processes that correlate with certain types of intuitive problem-solving tasks, and then measuring the rates at which people solve certain types of problems, which might indicate that they'll also be better at solving other tasks that we put in the category of intuitive. Okay, that makes sense. I'm really curious about the implications, though, of this type of brain stimulation research. Now that we know we can use technology to measurably boost people's ability to solve certain kinds of problems, when these researchers stimulate people's brains with transcranial direct current stimulation, TCDS, what's actually changing in their neurobiology? What's happening in their brains when they're stimulated by this device?
Well, I mean, I'm not doing that directly. That's the work of Chine Snyder. I'm reporting on it. And what I'm trying to do, my work is about trying to integrate that work with the psychological work so that we can get an overall coherent picture and try to bring some of the work that's being done on self-organizing criticality and small world network formulation in the brain in connection with insight to bear on what the neuroscience is saying and potentially what that means, what the TDCS is doing. Because right now what we have is we have sort of 4 areas of research that look like they're pointing towards a convergence, but the sort of hard theoretical work of making that convergence clear and apparent so as to facilitate further empirical research still hasn't been done. And that's one of the things I'm trying to do.
I see. So right now you're kind of working to streamline communication between researchers who are doing this direct current stimulation research and researchers in fields like connectomics to help them get a clearer picture of exactly what it means neurologically to gain a better ability to solve these problems. But is there anything we can say with certainty about the aha moment itself, that moment when you realize something? It seems like that moment must correlate with some kind of a sudden shift, like a tipping point in the behavior of certain brain networks, like they're spilling over into some new, different pattern of activation.
Well, I think there's sort of experimental research on attention. I think there's related experimental research and some neuroscience on mindfulness and how mindfulness facilitates insight. I think there's direct neuroscientific research, Young, Beeman, and Bowden, and others. Acunios, they have their new book out, The Eureka Moment, about what's happening in terms of brain activation. So there's several sort of strands within psychology, and then there's a couple strands within neuroscience, and then a couple strands within sort of mathematical modeling that are all sort of pointing towards a unified model. So I've tried to argue that I think what's going on in this is that an individual is redirecting attention along a couple of attentional axes. What this is doing is causing a shift in brain activation that alters, creates kind of a criticality stage in the way the brain is firing, and that alters the pattern of connectivity in the brain, converting, as I said, a regular network into a small world network. That causes a huge sort of boost in the fluency of processing. And that's why you're getting all of the sort of phenomenological effects and the cognitive effects associated with insight.
So that shift, is that a shift in focus from just general processing of the world at large down to focus on a specific problem?
Well, no, it's not quite that. The difference is between a regular network, and this is happening at a scale and variant level in the brain. It's happening at all levels of analysis, which I think is very important. A regular network is a network in which all the connections are local. And then a random network is a network in which you have some of the connections are local and some of them are long distance. And it turns out that a regular network with just local connections is actually extremely inefficient. Now, what happens I think in insight, and Schilling and others have argued this, is that you get one or two long-distance connections created. And what that does is that transforms a regular network into a small world network. Those one or two long-distance connections. So these small world networks kind of optimize. Vervaeke and others are doing work on this. They optimize between making your network as efficient as you can and as resilient as you can. And what's happening is insight is you're getting sort of a re-optimization and an improvement of that.
I see. So it's more about patterns of brain activity zeroing in from large scale to small scale and from inefficient to efficient at the moment we have a realization, the aha moment. Like the brain is tuning into the right pattern of activity for understanding that problem, for contextualizing it. Like the brain is going, okay, so this is the right pattern of activity to represent this thing, this problem, whatever it is.
That's right. And in fact, it seems to be given very preferential treatment by the brain. Like I said, Toberinsky and Reber and others of people have argued it leads to a spike in fluency. Fluency is a general, this is some current research, it's a general constraint on all of your processing. So the more fluent your processing is. And what this shows is that like even the difference between like the font and the background on a page, or the color of the letters and the color of the background, can influence people's judgment about how good the information therein is, how confident they can have in it. And so the brain seems to use sort of how efficiently and resiliently, right, how optimized its processing is to judge the quality of the content of what is processing, which is why people have so much confidence in their insight and why they even shows kind of a bias, a hindsight bias. It's kind of like, when you see pictures and there's like black and white blotches and you don't know what it is at first, and then suddenly something gels and you go, oh, it's a Dalmatian dog. And then if you try and go back and just see it as the color blotches, it's very hard to do.
Now, this leads into another interesting question, which I've heard you talk about in your lectures. That sense of an aha moment is a really common feature of the psychedelic drug experience. This feeling like, oh my God, it all makes sense now. So is there any way to distinguish scientifically between a genuine aha moment, like one that actually tells you something useful about reality, versus, I guess, a fake aha moment where you get the sense of realization, but later, when you come down, you realize you didn't actually understand anything new or anything useful? Is there a way to distinguish between those?
I don't think we have any sort of measure within the process itself. Because, as I said, the problem with some of this processing, or the problem with some of the aspects of this processing, more accurately, is it's not paying direct attention to the content, right? That's what I was just arguing. It's paying attention to the manner of the processing rather than to the content itself. Now, it turns out that evolution has fine-tuned that. So paying attention to these cost functions helps us to zero in on usually good content. But because the brain is not directly paying attention to the content, but more the manner of the processing, you can fall prey to all kinds of delusionary things. I talked about this in one of my talks. I mean, I make use of Frankfurt's notion of the distinction between lying and bullshitting. Right? The liar cares about the truth. He cares about the content of what is being said. But in bullshitting, what happens is the content is largely irrelevant. All that matters is the salience or the catchiness of the information. And so there's some work, a lot of work now starting to be done on this phenomenon, some initial experimental work. And I think one of the dangers, I'll talk about the benefits in a minute, but one of the dangers of altered states of consciousness is precisely the way that supersalience in those states can subject us to a kind of self-deception. We can sort of bullshit ourselves. And I mean, this is important because self-deception is better understood that way than lying to yourself. You can't really lie to yourself. But what you can do is you can, right, attention can manipulate what you find salient, and then you can get the kind of continual salient slippage, and you can get caught up in how catchy things are as opposed to paying attention to the truth content that you're processing. Now, I think the promise of altered states of consciousness is that they're not so much an insight within consciousness, but an insight of consciousness. You're getting sort of a comprehensive retuning of your salience lens, what you pay attention to, what you're foregrounding, what you're backgrounding. And that can afford, many comprehensive and potentially coherently linked or convergent insights in your experience. So that's why it has a tremendous capacity to be so transformative.
And this is such an important distinction, right, between the decisions we make while conscious versus the processes much deeper in our brains, far below the conscious level, that decide what we're able to be conscious of at all. I mean, a lot of it comes down to evolutionary responses against threats, doesn't it? Like, there's a lot of research that subconscious brain systems become aware that there's a person staring at us long before we become aware of that consciously. And there's also research that systems deep in our brains often make decisions as much as 7 seconds before we're consciously aware we've made the decision, which means not only do we have no control over what we're able to be conscious of in the first place, but it's not even clear how much control we have over our own decisions at the conscious level. Those things may be decided much deeper in our brains before we become conscious of them at all. And interestingly, that's pretty similar to what a lot of Eastern religions and philosophical traditions have been trying to tell us for a very long time.
Very much. I mean, very much. And I mean, this is why I'm also interested in the growing connection between cognitive science and Buddhism, because this kind of realization that's emerging as central in the core of the science is lining up with, some traditions that emphasize, a non-egoic way of construing agency and motivation and things like that. I teach. I have been teaching for a long time and practicing. I teach Vipassana meditation, Tai Chi Chuan. I know what it is to teach it practically. And the context of teaching, the context of training, and the language you use in training is very different than the language you use in trying to explain a phenomenon. So let me give you an example where this is non-controversial. Yeah. Many people have seen, Sherlock, and he uses his memory palace idea. Now, that's an ancient mnemonic, a way of improving memory. You think of your memory like a space, and you put specific objects in specific locations. And what you do when you want to remember is you sort of mentally travel through that space. And this really significantly improves your memory. Now, it can lead you to believe that that's how memory is organized. And that's all completely false. That is not how memory is organized at all. So the fact that a particular image or metaphor or even way of speaking trains memory well is very misleading when you actually move to trying to explain memory. It's the same thing with a lot of the mindfulness research. The language of training mindfulness has been imported uncritically into the attempts to try and scientifically explain it. What I have suggested is to try and reverse engineer the construct, if you will. What I mean is try and find those attentional processes within the mindfulness literature that map onto independently established constructs in psychology. I think we could get a clearer picture of how to operationalize it, how to better create active control groups, how to follow it up, right? And how to study the component processes within mindfulness, rather than always treating it as this unanalyzed sort of gestalt that we then say, oh, but it might reduce depression and it might do this.
Oh, I love this concept you talk about in your lectures, this concept of cognitive technologies. Like, for example, you describe mindfulness meditation as a cognitive technology, or philosophical logic as a cognitive technology. And a lot of these cognitive technologies, while they're very useful, were never designed to tell us scientific facts about the brain, right? They're designed to help us interface with our own mental machinery. So what would you say is the key difference between a cognitive technology like mindfulness or a philosophical debate versus the modern neuroscientific approach to understanding consciousness?
Well, I mean, I think that that's exactly the distinction. I mean, I think if I could use a distinction that I've been trying to also develop, I think that the neuroscience and the cognitive science are trying to give us knowledge about a particular phenomena, whereas the psychotechnologies that we've been talking about that you've just mentioned, their goal was to facilitate, the personal transformation that we call wisdom. I don't think wisdom and knowledge are the same thing, and people seek them for different reasons. I think they're both inherently valuable. I don't think they're unrelated, but I think they're far from identical ideas. And I think what's going on in the confluence between Buddhism and Cog-Sci is an attempt to try and say, well, can we link up the discourse of the knowledge of, mindfulness and insight to these practices that tried to make people wiser by actually facilitating the cultivation of insight, and increased empathy and self-regulation, etc.
This is something I've heard you talk about a lot, this need for a modern wisdom tradition informed by scientific data that gives us the tools we need, not so much to analyze the world as to find our place in it in factual, data-driven ways. And this kind of flies in the face of the popular conception of what wisdom is, right? I mean, the traditional approach is that scientists handle the knowledge side of things, the data, and then when we want wisdom, we go to the temple, the church, the ashram, whatever it is, and, never the twain shall meet. But you argue that this separate approach just doesn't work anymore. We need a wisdom tradition that's informed by what we know about ourselves now, what we know about how our brains and our body chemistry work and how the physical universe works. We need a new wisdom tradition that's driven by scientific data.
Oh, very much. I mean, this goes to sort of a larger issue that I talk about sort of the meaning crisis in Western society, because those two poles are not connected. I'll sometimes do this in class. I'll sometimes, say to my students, well, where do you go for information? And, the internet, blah, 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 blah. Oh, where do you go for knowledge? Well, we come to the university. And I say, okay, well, then where do you go for wisdom? And then there's silence. And they look around and there's kind of this nervous anxiety about, where should we go? Where do we go? You see, the thing is, if you look back at the traditions, the wisdom traditions are informed by sort of the best knowledge of the time. And I think we should be doing that. These wisdom traditions should be, I don't mean to sound hubristic or arrogant, but they should be renewed and revitalized by the knowledge we now have. And many Buddhists acknowledge this and other wisdom traditions. So I'm not saying something I think too arrogant, but I think the reverse is true. I think we should be paying attention, and I gave a talk on this once called The Wise Scientist, about how much we should want the people who are pursuing knowledge to also be pursuing wisdom, because, I mean, wisdom is fundamentally and ultimately about, overcoming the machinery within yourself of self-deception, right? And we should want the people who are pursuing knowledge to have their faculties fine-tuned for overcoming self-deception and for pursuing, right, insight and being able to pursue the long-term goals that knowledge requires by having improved self-regulation abilities. The scientific method is a fantastic psychotechnology, but it is not the only psychotechnology we should be using in order to get, the knowledge that we want and need.
And now, at the risk of pissing off everyone in the mindfulness meditation community, could it be possible that we'll soon be able to use neurotechnologies like transcranial direct current stimulation to trip the brain into a more mindful state, to artificially induce a state of mindfulness in the brain?
Okay, so there's some technologies on the market right now that promise to do that. I don't think there's good reason to believe they do. I do think that that's a very real possibility. We have found it was a PhD thesis where somebody had actually, they sort of scooped us. They had actually done studies about the interaction between the psychotechnology of mindfulness and, the cyber technology of transcranial direct current stimulation, and did in fact find a synergistic effect that they tend to bootstrap each other. I think that it's quite possible that the psychotechnologies and the cyber technologies we're going to figure out how to integrate them, I think, in the next 5 or 10 years in order to get a synergistic, optimization of both processes.
This is an idea that absolutely fascinates me. The idea that I talked about in the intro to this podcast, what if we could use neurotechnology, intelligence-enhancing neurotechnology, to bootstrap a loop in which we design even better neurotechnology, on and on, up the ladder of intelligence, this spiral, and who knows where it stops. Do you think that's actually a realistic prospect within our lifetimes? Do we seriously need to start thinking about the implications of that? Is it that close?
I think it's a real possibility. There's a possibility that we may be able to cultivate the wisdom and the knowledge to use the new technology that's emerging. And I think that would be, if we could do that, that would be very good. But you have to understand there's all kinds of other forces at work. I don't mean to sound like something from Dan Brown, but the military and corporations and all kinds of other interests are also pursuing these technologies and how they could be used to influence and manipulate people. There's a bit of a race. I was approached by somebody who was a representative of the U.S. government about, TDCS and mindfulness for the U.S. Army, and there's definitely stuff going on there. DARPA has been using some of this technology to try and induce the flow state. There's great opportunity. There's great risk. I worry about, governments and corporations getting a control of a reliable version of these kinds of technology. The kind of ability to directly manipulate and alter people's consciousness and cognition in a direct fashion is a scary possibility.
Oh, I'd say that's no secret at all. I'm not a conspiracy theory kind of guy at all, but it's common knowledge that the CIA and the U.S. Department of Defense were conducting research on mind-altering substances as far back as, the 1940s, the 1960s, mid-20th century. How successful they actually were with that research is another question, of course, but I don't think it's far-fetched at all, in any case, to say that the military would certainly be interested in using this kind of neurotechnology, for good purposes or ill.
And the problem is I don't have much faith in our political machinery in North America being responsive to this. This is very sophisticated and difficult, and science that's still theoretically in flux. We're not sure about any of this, right? And trying to get the legislation in hand ahead of time, I just don't have that much confidence. But we need to do something. We need to get this on the books before, the horse is out of the barn.
Right. And if it's possible to use transcranial direct current stimulation to induce mindfulness or to produce pleasure or to enhance intelligence, well, it's pretty obvious that that could be a really effective tool for torture, which is scary. And that brings up a really important point. Advanced neurotechnology, like any powerful technology, is a very double-edged sword. Right? I mean, if it can be used to help people, it can also be used to make people's lives much worse. And I think this brings it back to the wisdom question, doesn't it? I mean, it's not going to do any good to just try and resist these technologies and say, well, we shouldn't develop these kinds of technologies. They're just too dangerous. I mean, come on, give me a break. Somebody's going to develop them anyway. Some people are developing them now. It can't be stopped. What we need is a better way to put these technologies in context and develop a foundation of ethics, compassion, whatever you want to call it, in which people understand that there are acceptable ways to use these kinds of technology, and then there are unacceptable ways that are just not okay. And since these technologies are so new and the implications of them are so new, we're really lacking that kind of context, that foundation right now.
And I hope you understand that everything I've been saying so far in this interview has been under that, right? I'm talking about what we think, what's most plausible, where the lines of argument and evidence are heading. But yeah, all of what we're talking about here is all in question. This is still all under investigation. It is very plausible that significant revisions and insights and discoveries are still forthcoming and are going to change things in ways we can't anticipate.
This is another of my favorite ideas that you talk about in your TEDx talk. The idea that we may be on the brink of what you call a second axial age. The first axial age, of course, being that period around the 400s BCE when there was just this explosion of new cognitive technologies, Greek philosophy, alphabetic writing, Indian meditation practice, on. And the world on the other side of that revolution looked qualitatively different from anything that had come before it. I mean, human society would quite literally never look the same again after that. And you argue that we may be on the brink of another shift like that, possibly within the next 100 years or so, the development of a whole new array of cognitive technologies, neurotechnologies this time, which may transform our world just as drastically as the inventions of philosophy and writing did. I mean, if we develop the abilities to do things like increase or decrease someone's intelligence at will, or to induce altered states of consciousness at the flip of a switch. I mean, the society on the other side of that transformation might be all but unrecognizable to us from our perspective today.
It has that potential, yeah. I talked about the possibility of the second axial age as, a way of thinking about this. It's a real possibility. Yeah, and I think what's fundamental about that, and I sort of foreshadowed that when we were talking earlier about the confluence between Buddhism and third generation cog sci. I mean, what's central to the axial age isn't just the psychotechnologies, right? It's the fundamental alteration and change in the sort of understanding of what it is to be a human being and what it is to be wise. I mean, the notion of wisdom went through just this huge transformation from the pre-axial to the axial and post-axial periods. And so I think what's also coming, and this is, of course, what people, it's kind of obvious when you say it, what people can't foresee, a fundamental change in our self-understanding, what it is we are as cognitive agents, as conscious beings on the planet. Like, what does it mean? Let's just take one example. I think Jeffrey Hinton's right. I think autonomous AI is going to exist 20 years from now. What does that mean for our understanding of who and what we are? What does that mean for our understanding of, I don't like this term, but I don't have an alternative term for it. What does it mean for our spirituality as human beings? Right? What does all of that mean? We're going to have to fundamentally change our self-understanding. And it won't be just a change in what we believe about ourselves, with these new psychotechnologies integrated with cyber technologies, it'll be fundamentally ways in which we access and transform our cognition. It's going to be potentially be the kind of cultural change that I think we need in order to face some of the overwhelming problems that are confronting the planet right now.
And one would hope that by understanding our consciousness better, we might gain more compassion for others. Well, one would hope. But this actually touches on another of my favorite issues, one of my all-time favorite things to talk about on this podcast, which is the question of, are we asking the right questions about consciousness? In other words, I mean, in some of your lectures, you seem to suggest that the reason we keep hitting walls in consciousness research is that we keep framing our questions in the wrong ways.
I think Chalmers is on to something there, in that there's a distinction that should be made. And that distinction would let me say how I think, and some of my co-authors think, the problem has been potentially misframed. I mean, what Chalmers was actually doing was making a distinction between two types of questions that tend to get answered independently from each other. One is the question of the function of consciousness. What does it actually do? I mean, and this turns out to be a really hard question to give an easy answer to. It's really surprising. I'll sometimes do this with my class. Like, what would you give up for your consciousness? I promise to give you, unlimited wealth, and everybody in the world loves you, but you just won't be conscious of it. Will you take it? And everybody says, well, no, of course not. And then I say, well, right after that, I say, oh, well, then what is it your consciousness does for you? And everybody looks at me like, well, I don't know. And so that question about what the function of consciousness is a real question. But that's distinct from, and I think this was Chalmers' point, the question about what's the nature of consciousness in the sense of what's its ontological analysis? How can we explain its emergence from non-conscious, physical processes? And what tends to happen now is we tend to have theories that answer one of these questions, but not really address the other. So Barr's global workspace theory tends to be an account of the function of consciousness, right? Where I think you could understand Tononi's theory of integrated information as trying to get at the nature of consciousness. And part of what myself and, like I say, some of my co-authors, Anderson Todd, Richard Wu, what we're arguing is that it's probably better if we try and get an integrated answer to both questions at the same time, which makes it a lot harder. But what's tending to happen right now is it's turning out that as you try and answer one, you really have to have some clarity on the other one. Although they're analytically distinct and people are sort of pursuing them independently, it turns out that this is such a deep problem that trying to answer these questions independently of each other is probably misframing the scientific investigation. So that's the argument I would make. Not everybody would agree with what I just said, but you asked me what I think, and so that's what I think about it.
You're putting your finger on a real problem I've noticed when a lot of people talk about consciousness. I found it's very hard to get people to be clear about whether they're talking about the brain processes necessary for awareness versus those that are necessary for things like conscious self-reflection and a sense of self, right? Because awareness probably dates back very far in our evolutionary history. Probably insects and animals before the first vertebrates probably had some kind of subjective experience. But the ability to consciously self-reflect, to choose what to focus on, and to build a sense of self, that's a much rarer and more recent development, right? I mean, it only appears in certain mammals and maybe birds, as far as we know. So if consciousness in that sense, self-consciousness, is not necessary for survival, I mean, if so many animals, not to mention plants and bacteria and fungi, get along just fine without consciousness, and maybe even without subjective awareness at all, what evolutionary purpose does consciousness serve?
So one of the things we've been doing is we've been trying to see if there's a growing convergence, at least in the neuroscientific theories and the psychological theories about the function of consciousness. And myself and my co-authors, we are arguing that many of these people are sort of independently coming to the idea that sort of the fundamental job of consciousness is relevance realization. Reed Montague's similar kind of idea that the distinguishing feature between us and computers is that we care about the information we're processing. But the thing is, if that's the case, then that might start to tell us something about why we get the kinds of experiences we do when we're conscious. Because if an entity is conscious in this involved way, right, if it's having to do this very massively recursive, massively self-organizing relevance realization, it is going to be processing information as a salience landscape. Certain things are going to be standing out as salient, foregrounded. Other things are going to be backgrounded. That's going to be constantly shifting in an ongoing texture. And that salience landscape is going to be constantly affecting, as we were talking earlier, how you size up situations, how you formulate problems, what kinds of insights are available to you. And so that's why we would even see connections between insight and consciousness, why insight is experienced as a flash of consciousness, like a light bulb going on, and this alteration of salience and the alteration of cognition. So I think that's one way in which you could do it. If you could find sort of a central function and then get at how that function alters consciousness through the way it generates in an ongoing, flowing manner, a salience landscape, and then the functionality of that salience landscape as setting up, a field in which problems are formulated and situations are sized up. I think then we can start to bridge the gap between the nature question, the function question, and the nature question.
And this leads into the question of what exactly the salience landscape is, right? In one of your lectures, you brought up the classic thought experiment. What is it like to be a bat? Can we imagine what it's like to be a bat? And you basically point out that this is kind of a stupid question because a bat pays attention to completely different things than we do. It may be possible for a human to imagine what it's like to be a bat from a human's perspective, but we may not be able to imagine what it's like to actually be a bat. I mean, that may be impossible. And yet, at the same time, if we could somehow experience the inner life of a bat, we might find that subjectively it feels pretty much the same as it feels to be a human. In other words, subjective experience, may simply be what consciousness feels like from the inside, whether you're a bat or a human or anything else.
Right. So this goes back to like what I was saying earlier. We can't and we shouldn't try to have a theory of insight, right? Because insight doesn't intrinsically exist in things. And in a very real sense, we can't have a scientific theory of relevance. The class of things that are relevant isn't homogeneous, it isn't stable, and it isn't an intrinsic property of things. We can only have a theory of how organisms are realizing relevance, creating a salience landscape for themselves. So we shouldn't be, there's a sense in which we could have a universal theory about the kind of processing by which a salience landscape is generated by a bat and by which it's generated by a human. But that is not going to give us, the ability to experience it the way a bat does, because we just are not capable of finding things relevant the way a bat is. This goes back to Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein once famously said, even if lions could talk, we wouldn't understand them. I think that's a misformulated question. How can I experience what a bat can experience? That's like asking what's north of the North Pole. It's a poorly formulated question because it's assuming that relevance is itself, a topic for which we can have a scientific theory, and I don't think that's correct. It's like Darwin didn't give us a theory of evolutionary fittedness because that's not a homogeneous set. Some creatures are fit because they're tall, small, complex, simple, short lifespans, long lifespans, blah, blah, blah. There's no homogeneous set. And fittedness isn't intrinsic to the organism. It's an ongoing, dynamic, shifting relationship between the organism and the environment. The same thing for relevance and salience. It's right. The things you find salient and relevant don't form a homogeneous cat. It's constantly evolving and shifting in the relationship between the organism and the environment. This is part of what's called third generation cog-sci, in which you try and look for cognition not just sort of in the brain, but in the dynamic coupling between the brain and the environment, and how that ongoing evolving relationship is actually constitutive of cognition.
This is something I'm hearing neuroscientists and artificial intelligence researchers talk about more and more, embodied cognition, right? Consciousness isn't something that takes place exclusively in the brain or even in the body. It's a phenomenon that involves the entire environment. In other words, however much of the quote-unquote external universe we can perceive, all that stuff is part of our consciousness too, or our consciousness is part of it, or both. And again, strangely, this is exactly what a lot of Eastern philosophical traditions have been trying to tell us for a long time.
Again, helping to explain, very, very good point. Again, helping to explain this confluence. So I think one of the reasons why third generation cognitive scientists, people who and I consider myself one of them, people who emphasize embodiment and embeddedness, as you were just talking about, why we're so interested in Buddhism, because we're looking for a vocabulary, even a phenomenological vocabulary for describing, well, what does agency and what does cognition and what does mind and action mean when you shift your metaphysics from this sort of Cartesian localized, situating of cognition and consciousness to this embedded, embodied, dynamic relationship to the environment. Like, we need a different phenomenological vocabulary. We need a different theoretical vocabulary. And I think that's, again, one of the reasons why you see this confluence between third generation cog-sci and Buddhism.
So we've covered a really wonderfully broad range of topics today. I mean, neurotechnology, problem solving, intelligence, mindfulness, even consciousness itself. So to you, what's the common thread that weaves all this together? How do you see these things converging in your own research?
All of my scientific projects, all of my cognitive science at U of T, it is ultimately for me in service of this existential project that I alluded to earlier. I'm very concerned about, and more people are talking about this, about sort of a growing meaning crisis in society. The fact that we've lost, I think for most people, we've lost the religious and metaphysical framework that sort of legitimated the axial revolution and gave us a way of understanding how to pursue wisdom and self-transcendence and compassion and virtue. So I'm really concerned about whether or not we can get enough going about that we can afford people a real response to the meaning crisis. Because, I mean, there's increasing evidence that it's having deleterious effects. Like there's the mental health crisis at the university, all kinds of other things, the massive spiking in suicide worldwide. I mean, I understand that there's economic and other factors, but there also seems to be increasing issues of a meaning crisis. There are people who are now studying this within psychology, and also its corresponding idea of meaning in life. What does that mean, and why is it so important to human beings? And so I'm hoping that all of this research will do two things: help people become aware of this issue, why it's important, and also aware of how there might be, as you suggested, following up on a suggestion of mine, that we might be on the cusp of a kind of transformation that could alleviate that problem in a significant way. To the degree to which our cognition is in, and we are fundamentally disconnected from ourselves, I think is a degree to which we are impaired in addressing these issues. So that would be something I would want people to start to think about and pay attention to.
I'm really excited to hear that you see a lot of the same convergences that I do, a lot of things that I've talked about on this podcast before. And I'm really glad that somebody out there is working to bring these lines of research together. Because I agree with you completely. I think we're on the verge of a major neurotechnological paradigm shift. I've talked about that a lot on this podcast before. And I think what we need is not more restrictions and fears around these kinds of technologies. I don't think that's helpful. I think what is helpful, what we need, is a context of scientifically inspired wisdom that shows us how to use these technologies responsibly. Well, John Vervaeke, thank you so much for joining me today on the Connectome podcast. And for everyone listening right now, I've got lots of cool new research to discuss next time. Until then, have a great week, everybody. Go do some science!